When my kids were in elementary school, I spent a lot of time on Little League baseball fields, sometimes watching and cheering them on, but more often than not, coaching. For a few years, I coached with another Episcopal priest who also had a son on the team, and we had a blast doing this. Although, if you ever wondered whether God cares about Little League baseball, the answer is a resounding no. Our teams were terrible. Mostly because during the pre-season draft, we always stacked our team with young Episcopalians. Now, we did lead the league in kids who could recite the Nicene Creed, which is something. But not a single one of those Episcopal kids could hit for power, so we were always doomed. One of the things that used to frustrate me as a Little League coach was that the kids just weren't all that interested in the nuances of the game. But it finally dawned on me that they don't really watch games anymore. They're more into the highlight reels, the top 10 plays on ESPN. And in fairness, home runs and diving catches are a lot more exciting than hitting the cutoff man. But this isn't just a get off my lawn rant. I'm sharing this because today's gospel passage is basically a highlight reel. It's like two of Jesus' greatest hits all rolled into one. We get the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with the loaves and the fishes, and we get Jesus walking on water. These are the home runs and diving catches of Scripture. While, say, John's 4-chapter-long farewell discourse is the scriptural equivalent of hitting the cutoff man. But as a preacher, you can't help but think, couldn't they have spread this out a little bit? Because there is a lot going on here with any number of threads to pull on. But it's important, I think, to reflect upon why and how these two well-known stories are linked together for us this morning. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle story that appears in all 4 gospel accounts, besides the resurrection, which means that it is one of the most important texts in all of Scripture. And it has all the elements you'd expect: a potentially troubling and dangerous situation, a miracle, Eucharistic undertones, a misinterpretation by the crowds. And this story always precedes the account of Jesus walking on water, which also has all the elements you'd expect: danger, a miracle, baptismal undertones, a misinterpretation by the disciples. So we see this movement between Jesus performing a public miracle in front of a large crowd, followed by a much more intimate miracle among his disciples. Obviously, both of these stories have miraculous elements. Turning a few loaves and some fish into an abundant meal for thousands of people is miraculous. Walking on water is miraculous. And I don't want to minimize these outward signs of Jesus' divine power. Again, this is the highlight reel. But the underlying miracle in both of these stories is the sudden recognition of Jesus' divinity. The miracle is the revelation of Jesus' true identity as the Son of God. The fullness of who Jesus really is made known to the crowds through the meal and to the disciples through his ability to offer them safe passage across the rough sea. Both miracles are performed in response to a very human need. With the crowds, it's hunger. With the disciples, it's fear. 5,000 people in the hot sun with nothing to eat. A small group of disciples terrified by a storm, hunger, and fear. And it is right into the midst of human need that God's love and grace suddenly appears in the form of Jesus Christ. That's the connective tissue between these two stories, and it's what connects us to this text. Our human needs shift and change over the course of our lifetimes, and every time God's love and grace shows up. We all experience fear and anxiety, hopelessness and hurt, grief and regret. None of us are immune to the heartbreaking aspects of the human condition. Some of you may be bearing an untold burden this very morning. But when we look to Jesus, when we look to the God of all compassion, God's love and grace shows up every single time to nourish us, to calm our souls, to bind up our wounds, to heal our hearts. Jesus shows up and showers God's love and grace upon the crowds, upon the disciples, upon us. One other point I'd like to highlight that feels particularly relevant in our current national climate is the verse that stands as something of a bridge between the feeding story and Jesus walking on the water. We hear that when Jesus realized that the crowds were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. They wanted to make Jesus their king. Now, at one level, the crowds are correct. Jesus is a king. Later in John's Gospel, at his trial, Jesus acknowledges his kingship to Pontius Pilate. You say that I am a king. For this end I was born, and for this I came into the world to bear witness to the truth. But of course, his kingdom is not of this world. The reign of Christ is about love and compassion, not power and might. But here we have an example of the crowd seeking to twist Jesus' identity to serve their own purposes. They want a military king to throw off the yoke of Roman rule and oppression, and they have projected these hopes and desires upon Jesus. They have sought to make Jesus not in God's own image, but in an image they themselves have crafted, one that fits their own agendas. Now, we all do this to a degree, forming God in our own image. But where I've seen this more and more is in our national political discourse, using Christianity to fit a particular narrative, using the veneer of faith to advance political agendas. Now, politicians have always used faith for their own purposes. That's nothing new. But we need to be particularly wary of this in our own day. Because when you see politicians holding up faith as a mere tool for their own messaging, when you see politicians implying that God is exclusively on their side, when you see politicians using faith as a shield to protect themselves from criticism, when you see politicians proclaiming that they alone are God's messenger, when you see politicians using the language of faith to set up a holy war between good and evil, and they're always the ones on the side of good, well, guess what? It's no longer about the one who came not to be served, but to serve. It's no longer about the God of love and grace. It's about twisting Jesus' words and actions to fit your own self-serving narrative. Now, before you start going too far down a certain road, this isn't a partisan thing. This is part of an ongoing, complicated, entangling relationship between politics and faith. And as Christians, our role is to untangle this knot and always listen for the voice of God's love and grace. As this election season unfolds, I simply encourage you to be mindful of the messaging, to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, as you are bombarded with everyone seeking to control the narrative. And then keep coming back to the only highlight reel that actually matters. The one that keeps us grounded in uncertain and turbulent times. The stories of Scripture. The stories of Jesus. The stories of God's love and grace.